because we care about it so much.
I know. Well, it's funny because, so I think this episode, my thoughts are primarily focused on Faramir, I will say. And then Helm's Deep, I'm like, the more I think about it, and maybe it's just like the mood I'm in right now, there are some things that are lost and some things that are like expanded upon. But overall, it's like fine. You know?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not. I don't have anything compared to. I'm not mad. I'm just like, oh, a battle scene.
Right. Yeah, I think that there are something like I was trying to think about this, and it probably doesn't make sense to do it like this, but just given the knowledge that when Frodo is actually at the Black Gate of Mordor, that is when like the battle is over by the time he makes it there. So I'm like, damn, he was stuck in the Eomer and the Dead Marshes forever.
That's
And
too long.
it's actually not that long. Actually, let's just get this part out of the way because I need someone to hear my thoughts about it. For anybody wondering, the timeline of Two Towers is bananas. And we know this because in the appendices of Return of the King, Appendix B includes said timeline. It also includes some good stuff on all of the Third Age as well as some of the Second Age, which is good info if you're curious about what's supposed to happen in the Rings of Power show. But let's just look at February, okay? So the Fellowship breaks February 26th. Way back in Fellowship of the Ring, right?
Way back.
Way back when, several episodes ago. And then, let's see, Merry and Pippin escape from the orcs on February 29th. So 3 days later. And that's when they meet Treebeard.
Okay.
And Frodo descends from the Eomer and meets Gollum at the same time. Only 3 days later. Okay? And then a day later, the Entmoot begins. Eomer and meets Aragorn at the same time that the Entmoot is happening. But we don't find out about those things at the same time. So it's interesting. Like to be like, oh, it like confuses me reading it like this. March 1st, Frodo begins the Passage of the Dead Marshes. Aragorn meets Gandalf the White. Frodo comes to the end of the marshes on the 2nd. Gandalf comes to Edoras and heals Theoden. And then on the 3rd, Theoden retreats to Helm's Deep. Battle of the Hornburg begins on the same day that they get there. Theoden and Gandalf set out from Helm's Deep for Isengard a day later. Wow. It's a whole one-day battle. Frodo reaches the Slag Mound on the edge of the Desolation of the Morannon, so he's near the Black Gate at that time. Theoden reaches Isengard at noon on the 5th, and they're talking to Saruman. That is also when Frodo is in sight of the Black Gate, which we kind of knew based on what was said in the Black Gate Opens chapter. But it's just like boom, 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 all these things happening at once. And then it cuts to some of the Return of the King dates. But it's just crazy, like, okay, so Frodo gets out of the Eomer at the end of February, and then he comes to the end of the marshes. Why is everything happening so fast? But also, yeah. So, like, in the time that it takes Frodo to walk, all of this battle stuff is happening.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's wild. Like, where's the Faramir stuff?
Did he not include it?
Oh, so, no, it's here. So, like, Frodo is taken by Faramir at the same time that Aragorn comes to Dunharrow, and that's where you see, like, the muster of the Rohirrim in Return of the King, like, where Theoden is gathering men before they ride to Gondor.
Okay.
So, with that in mind, it's interesting to think about, like, what if. Now, I know I didn't do an intro before we started talking about this, but I'm just going to go for it. Hi, and welcome to Tolkien with Friends. We're in it today. We have a lot of thoughts about Faramir and Helm's Deep. So, come along on this bizarre journey. So, I'll do more of a cover off of what we're supposed to be talking about, but this is me on a tangent. So, welcome to that. So, if Frodo isn't, like, all of the stuff that really happens with Legolas, Aragorn, like everybody else besides Frodo and Sam, happens by the time Frodo is at the Black Gate, and like several days before he meets Faramir. What if the movie had been structured like to really focus on like all of that stuff, and to like have the part with Saruman in the Two Towers movie, like it's supposed, like it is in the book, and then cut to Frodo, you know, and Sam's stuff, and then the cliffhanger is like him being taken by Faramir. Then it kind of would have lined up actually with the events of Return of the King.
Mm-hmm. From what we've seen of Peter Jackson's directing style, he kind of likes to leave off on a big bang.
Just for thought experiment's sake. So we have the Two Towers. It can be pretty similar, but then we stay with Merry and Pippin, Legolas, and Gimli for a longer period. So from maybe the Passions of the Dead Marshes, and then we just stay with them, you know? Like, we do some flipping back and forth in the beginning, then we stay with them, and we get to the scene with Saruman, like after Helm's Deep. Obviously, Helm's Deep would have to be a little bit different. And granted, like, as we all should know by this point, like, there weren't actually that few people at Helm's Deep. Like, it was all exaggerated, like, insane amount of orcs. It's just, like, everything's insane by Peter's version, which I get. And we would have to probably be closer to the book in terms of to get through it in this way. But so we have, maybe that's like our climax of the movie still, but then we can still maybe have, but you know how in a climax you can still have stuff afterwards. So then we would have the stuff with Saruman and Isengard, and so then we get to see more of Saruman, because I think we all deserve more Christopher Lee in our lives.
Every single person does.
Every single person. Cal agrees.
He does. He's very
passionate about Christopher Lee and his portrayal of Saruman. And you know what? We can all get behind that. Right? So then, cut to Frodo deciding to not... And maybe, like, you have Frodo deciding around the time of Helm's Deep or something that he isn't going to actually go into the Black Gate. Great. Whew. Right? And then he's traveling, and then he runs into Faramir, and we're not sure if he's good or bad yet, you know. But then we could have in the Return of the King being like, okay, what's going on there? And Faramir does give them kind of a scare, which we'll talk about, but then it turns out he's a good guy, and then we don't have to ruin his character.
But you feel like his character is ruined?
Well, let's get into it. Okay? So, in today's episode, sorry for the tangent. Hope you were here for it. If not, oops. So, in this episode, we are talking about finishing the Two Towers, the movie, because it's really only most of the chapter of Helm's Deep chapters, window on the west and the Forbidden Pool, all the stuff in Ithilien with Faramir, and then like a millisecond of the road to Isengard and Journey to the Crossroads, but we'll cover those more fully next time. So for the stuff about Faramir, I think if you've talked to any book fans for any length of time, that's probably one of the first things they will bring up. It's one of the first videos I ever made on TikTok was about like how I would fix Faramir stuff with just one line on TikTok, and that was like the first one that got like a bunch of comments because everyone was like, "I knew what you were going to say. Like, I totally agree." It's not like a controversial stance to dislike Faramir's treatment in the movie.
Wow.
So in the movie, Faramir scoops Frodo and Sam up, barely talks to them, right? Except to ask if they're spies. Then again, when Gollum shows up, he wakes Frodo up. That's accurate, but they cut out a lot of dialogue in between. And while the series of events isn't wrong, like a ton of the dialogue is cut, and I get it, right? It's a movie. We're moving at a different pace. But instead of doing like what they do with Gandalf, where it's just like he's saying the same lines but fewer of them, or just leaving things out entirely, like they maybe do with some other characters, but keeping, other things, whatever. To me, they basically take things that he does say, and then they twist it to give him a different behavior. So, for example, in the extended edition, they added this scene. This is background until we get to the part where they change Faramir, but I need this. So, in the extended edition, there is a scene after a victory in Osgiliath. It's a flashback with Boromir and Denethor, so Faramir's brother and his dad. And Denethor pulls Boromir aside and tells Boromir that Elrond is calling a council to Rivendell, which, as we've said in previous episodes, it was more of like a lucky happenstance. Like, I say called to me not because I called you, but because like some higher purpose has kind of called you all here at the same time, right? And Denethor says he has guessed it is about the One Ring. Like, he thinks that the One Ring has been found. This whole scene is bonkers, but like this line sends me over the edge. It's just no way could he have known that. Everyone of like Denethor's stance, and similar to Saruman, believed that it had believed that it had like fallen down into the sea or like lost in the Anduin at some time. Nobody thinks that this ring is findable. Like, that is why it is so like, oh my gosh, it's here, So I just like, even though he does have like the Palantir, one of the Seeing Stones, which we'll definitely talk about later, about why Denethor's kind of a jerk, is because he's been driven mad by Sauron through the Palantir. Sauron would not have known. That's the whole point, right? He couldn't have given him that information. Where is he getting that from? It's bananas. It's a bananas line that they threw in there, and I hate it. But anyway,
they took it back out, so
yeah, they sure did. If you've only seen the theatrical versions, maybe that's all right. So but I mentioned this because later when Faramir is questioning Gollum in the movie, which is overly cruel, by the way, particularly compared to the books, like he's not like, there's people like kicking Gollum and stuff. That's not how it goes down. But he's questioning Gollum. They make it out like Faramir guesses that Gollum's precious is the One Ring. He says they stole it from us. He says they stole what from you? My precious. And then they cut from that to him immediately going to Frodo saying, so this is the answer to all the riddles, And so here's the full quote of that from the book. So this is the answer to all the riddles. And then a cut line, the One Ring that was thought to have perished from the world, and Boromir tried to take it by force, and you escaped, and ran all the way to me. And then back to what's in the movie, and here in the wild I have you, 2 halflings, and a host of men at my call. Cut line, and the Ring of Rings, a pretty stroke of fortune. A chance for Faramir, captain of Gondor, to show his quality. Now, they use this quote to make it out like Faramir will take the ring to Gondor before ultimately changing his mind by the end of the movie, right? But I love this scene in the book because it is not Gollum who reveals the purpose of the quest to Faramir. Do you wanna guess what actually happens? Like who actually slips up in that moment?
Sam?
Yeah. My poor man. My poor baby Sam. So Sam, as we know, has only Frodo's best interest at heart, and he will protect this boy and this man for all time, right? He'll do whatever he can to protect Frodo. And he is suspicious of Faramir. But Faramir, there's so much dialogue that's cut from him that really reveals his true nature. At one point, Sam tells him that Frodo, somebody says that he reminds him of Gandalf. Like, Faramir reminds them of Gandalf.
Okay.
And, Frodo perceives that he is, wiser than his brother Boromir. So there's all this stuff that they talk about. Faramir questions them, really just trying to figure out, like, what their deal is, because normally the rule is to kill somebody on sight that they find in Ithilien that's a stranger to them. But he doesn't, because they're like, what? They don't even know what Hobbit is, So, but Faramir, being a wise person and a learned person, he decides to get to the bottom of it first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when Sam is listening to him talk, and Faramir kind of gives like a history of elves and men to them, particularly as it relates to Faramir's background. Sam hears Faramir refer to the elves with reverence, and that earns Sam's respect and quiets his suspicions. So Sam is kind of feeling good about where things are with them right now. For example, Faramir is one of the only people in the Fellowship that the Fellowship meets after they're broken, along the road, that doesn't freak out about the fact that they've met Galadriel. He's like, wow, that's really awesome for you, rather than like, oh my gosh, like, she's
a witch.
Yeah, like a sorceress and, not to be trusted. Faramir does not react like that. And he goes into more detail about meeting her and describes her to Faramir, and Faramir says, she must be lovely indeed, but, and calls her perilously fair. And Sam is like, I wouldn't say perilous. He's like, people take their peril with them into Lorien and find it there because they've brought it. And he, as I think you probably remember when we were talking about this scene in the book, is that we talk about who was bringing the evil to Lorien, and it was Boromir, really. And this is brought up again. Sam says, like, now he starts to say Boromir's name, and Faramir's like, Boromir? Like, what were you gonna say? Yeah, like, just say it. So he goes on and ends with, and it's my opinion that in Lorien, he, meaning Boromir, first saw clearly what I guessed sooner, what he wanted. From the moment he first saw it, he wanted the enemy's ring. And then it's just like, Sam goes red in the face, Frodo is like, Sam? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And Sam flips out, and he realizes he's put his foot in his mouth, and he tells Faramir, he's like, oh, you've got me all, like, messed up, talking about elves, and, like, acting so kind and trustworthy, he's like, okay, now's your chance to show your quality. It's not a sassy remark from Denethor, it's Sam literally saying, be the man you have presented yourself to be, like, prove yourself right, like, are you, like, have your actions back up your words, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have that quote from Faramir, the answer to all the riddles. And this moment, and both Sam and Frodo, after he says this, are like grabbing at their sword hilts. They're like, oh shit, what's about to happen? But this is Tolkien pulling another Strider, as in making our hero act super sus for no reason. Like when we first met Aragorn and Bree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. It's Faramir, like, I don't know why our main guys, like the best of the best, gotta pull these sus moments, but they do. I think it's Tolkien building some kind of suspense, but
Sure.
basically Faramir passes the test where his brother failed. Um, and I love this exchange because it really shows like the sweetness of Sam and how he is really following his heart, like no matter what. Like we're on the borders of Mordor, right? Like your senses should be up. Like you should be so suspicious of everybody, you know? But Faramir, reassures him and says, your heart is shrewd as well as faithful and saw clearer than your eyes, trying to say, like, and he says something along the lines of, if you have stumbled, think it's fated to be so because, I'm going to stick to my word, like what I said earlier, because earlier he had said something along the lines of, if I had found this thing, before he even knew what it was, he guessed near to the mark, basically, that Frodo was carrying something, and he had said that he would not take this thing if it lay by the highway. And he, takes that seriously. He's like, to me, that is a vow, and I won't, go against that. I meant it. Mm-hmm. And it does make you wonder, I'm sure, when people read that for the first time. I don't know. I mean, I know I thought it, like, what if Faramir had gone to Rivendell? Because he was the one that originally had the dream that Boromir had as well, that led him to want to go to Rivendell in the first place, about like seek the sword that was broken, the stuff about the halfling and Isildur's bane. But that is a thought experiment that I have run, and I think it did have to be Boromir because the Fellowship did have to break,
and he was a big cause of the breakage.
Exactly. And it's like, it sucks because I think in this is really the point where we get, like, we traveled with Boromir literally as a reader, but I don't think we really got to know him per se. But this is a point where Faramir really takes time to explain his brother to Frodo and doesn't blame him for not parting friends with Boromir because he knows, like, who Boromir is and how he's, proud man. He honors valor and would have done anything to save his city. Like, it's all, he loves his brother, but you can see, like, where they're different. And I just think that Frodo needed to find Faramir at this point anyway. Like, it's great that he found an ally so close to Mordor because, like, not to mention, like, Faramir gives him food and stuff for them to pack and, helps replenish their stores. Mm-hmm. And is, gives them a few days to rest and all of this and gives him advice. It's a good moment for Frodo and Sam, I think. And we'll see, Faramir get to communicate this later to Gandalf when Gandalf and Pippin go to Minas Tirith. Mm-hmm. So Faramir needed to be there. But, so, I think that can kind of show you some of the things that they do to change Faramir. Like the whole going to Osgiliath thing in the movie, it just doesn't happen because Faramir never entertains the idea of using the ring for Gondor. But for the movie's sake, I wanted to get your take, Ahnna, as someone who's really only seen the movies and is just now hearing me explain this for the first time, on how Faramir is presented. So, in the appendices for the movies, one of the writers, Philippa Boyens, talks about how they felt that they basically needed to change Faramir because they have spent all this time trying to demonstrate how irresistible the ring is, and that and essentially implying that it wouldn't have been believable to have Faramir come along and say, I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway, which he does say, but which admittedly he says before he knows about the ring. But Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that it's true for most audiences that Frodo needed to come across somebody that would have, we see more people kind of like falling for the lure of the ring?
As a plot device, I, can see why it would be helpful for them to keep pushing, like, hey, it's so irresistible. This task that they're doing is so difficult. Look at all this peril that they're going through. Um, you know, I kind of I get that. It is it is a shocker for me to hear that people don't like Faramir. Like I
Well, it's
like
not so
his
much
character.
that they
And
don't like him, but that they feel like the change was too significant.
okay, because I'm just thinking of like in Two Towers, yeah, he's a little sus. He last minute is like, just kidding. I'm not gonna, mess with you. But you feel so bad for him in Return of the King.
Yeah.
And Pippin has this amazing song when he's like riding off to die. And I'm like, I stand Faramir, He's so
Yeah.
much better than his brother and he gets treated like shit by his dad. And, he had one minor slip up, but didn't go all the way, mess up
Yeah.
the ring. So I'm like,
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is that like after they do this whole thing, like taking him to Osgiliath, and like Frodo hands himself on a silver platter to the Nazgul, but like none of that happens, right? Because if it had, Frodo would have there's no, I mean, it would have been over, you know? Um but they take him to Osgiliath in the movies, and then it isn't, and I just feel like there's so much cognitive dissonance around that. Like, it's Sam's speech at the end, about like the folks in those stories had chances of turning back, only they didn't. And that's actually taken from a speech that Sam, or like a conversation that Sam and Frodo have later on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. But that's adapted, and it is a beautiful writing. It is a beautiful speech that Sam gives. But then Faramir hears that and says to Frodo, I think we understand each other better now. And he does say that in the book, but at a different moment after actually listening to Frodo. So it's weird the way that they did that to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that the trouble that people have with movie Faramir is just knowing that Faramir doesn't do any of those things. He doesn't have a moment with the ring, and he also doesn't ever see it. Like they have him like seeing it. I don't know. Frodo is always pulling out this ring in the movie, and it's like, no,
flash it off.
he's not doing that either. So it's just like, I think it's because after that it like basically corrects back to how Faramir really does act, more or less. And so it's like, I don't know, it just feels like thrown in there to me. Like, I don't really feel like it is showing Faramir growing in any way. He just seems to change his mind. I don't know, it doesn't hit for me.
Mm-hmm. Understood.
But I don't know how you felt about that scene, or like just the whole interaction with Faramir, like how it played out in the movies.
Yeah, I mean, since I until today found out that it was much different, I was pretty like, oh, okay, this tracks. They're just running into another obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and I get it. Like, everyone else in the movie is like running into an obstacle, right? Like, Merry and Pippin are taking down Isengard with Treebeard, Helm's Deep with the rest of the crew, and then Frodo and Sam are, just supposed to be having a good time with Faramir. But what's funny is that, like, knowing the timeline now, that actually doesn't. Their obstacle was more or less the getting into Mordor and realizing there's no way to sneak in through the front gate. Obviously not as maybe theatrical as Helm's Deep or that's taking out Isengard. So they give this whole Osgiliath battle scene to Frodo and Sam to try to survive.
I guess.
But I just hate that the Nazgul shows up and Frodo's just like, yeah, cool, take
and
me.
somehow Sam runs his little ass up those stairs and saves him last minute.
I'm just like, if the Nazgul was there, like they've met Frodo before. This isn't news to them. They've been pursuing a halfling. The fact that they can run into a Nazgul and then escape and not see a Nazgul again until they're in Minas Morgul is crazy to me. It's just like, no, they would have been like, screw this, we're chasing the halfling again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to say, but
you have a lot to say. So.
I know, but just yeah, it just it doesn't sit right. But
good to know.
But yeah, I've been trying like all week to give an excuse for it, but now I'm here talking to you about it. I can't do it.
Don't. You just don't like it. And it makes sense. You said some valid things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that validation. Because, there are so many good things in these, but it's just one of those departures that I can't sit with. I can't do it. One thing a couple of things related to when they're leaving Faramir. Obviously, in the movie, they're doing it in Osgiliath instead of in Ithilien at Henneth Anun, like their little hideaway. But Faramir does dwell on the fact that Gollum is taking them to Cirith Ungol. He doesn't like it. And Gollum doesn't want to tell him that that's where he's taking them, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Gollum refuses to answer Faramir's question. Frodo's the one that has to tell them the plan. And Faramir is like, is Cirith Ungol its name? And at first, Gollum says no. And then it says, and then he squealed as if something had stabbed him. Yes, we heard the name once, but what does the name matter to us? And I feel like that is probably one of the only, like, tangible instances of the ring kind of holding Gollum to his promise to, like, serve Frodo. I don't know why, but it's interesting to me that he can't seem to lie about it.
Okay.
I don't know. It's interesting that is called out. And then he squealed as if something had stabbed him. That just stood out to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because he does do that, and in the movie, like Faramir has him in a chokehold, which Faramir isn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't. It's not. He just asks him.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that is interesting to me, I tried to explain this to Josh, but I don't think he really cared. But there's a point where, similar to in the movie, Faramir's like, hey, your little creepy friend is in our pool, and that is, like, you cannot show up to our hideaway. I'm supposed to kill him. Should I do it? And Frodo is like, no, don't do it. And one of the reasons we know at this point that Faramir knows Gandalf, and that he learned a little bit from him while he was making his many visits to Minas Tirith.
Mm-hmm.
And we also learned that Denethor doesn't really care for Gandalf, but Faramir is a fan, so that tells you also anything about Faramir. But Frodo tells him, no, Gandalf, he's like, I don't know clearly why, but Gandalf would not want you to kill Gollum. He even told the elves not to kill him when they had him captured.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that happens. And then later when he's like, dude, don't go to Cirith Ungol. Even, like, he's like, we don't go that way. Obviously, that's, like, hella Sauron territory. Like, the Witch King lives there. They're near there at Minas Morgul. But when you talk to older people that do know more about, they, like, refuse to speak of it. And in the movie, he says a dark terror lives there, which we find out later is Shelob.
Right.
So, but at that point, Faramir kind of pulls a Frodo, and it's like Gandalf. He's like, I don't believe Gandalf would have wanted to go this way. And Frodo's like, all right, well, Gandalf isn't here, and I have to take the paths that I can, as such that I can find. And it's like, okay, so the Gandalf reason works. Like, you're allowed to use Gandalf to back up your arguments, but Faramir is not. Interesting, Frodo.
Oh no.
I just thought that was funny because it's like, what? I mean,
Right.
obviously, later we learned that like there really is no other way they could have gone. But I just thought that was funny.
Sassy.
Yeah, a little bit, and you know, Faramir doesn't question him on that at all. But I would have been like, really? Okay, so you get to use Gandalf, but I do not. Rude.
No.
So that is the part with Faramir. You know, they part friends, and Faramir essentially. Faramir doesn't like Gollum. He's like, this is a wicked creature, and you know, Frodo's like, well, not wholly wicked, and he's like, well, maybe not wholly wicked, but I can tell that this guy has killed before. So
Bad
like,
news bears.
exactly. So what he does is he tells Frodo that he has leave, and he's under Faramir's protection for a year and a day. And then if he presents himself to Denethor within that time, you know, to like extend his, you know, ability to walk around Ithilien as much as he wants, and also extends that whoever walks with Frodo is under the same protection. So Gollum is only safe as long as he's with Frodo. He's like, if I ever see you again alone, like you're done.
That's so official.
Yeah, it is. It's very like, you know, Faramir captain talking at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, you know, where they leave Faramir, and then they're headed towards the crossroads, which is the point where the road leading to Mordor, you can either go south to the ocean, you can go north to the Black Gate, which, you know, we've been there, done that, we don't need to go that way. You can go west towards Osgiliath or east to the Morgul Vale and Minas Morgul. And so that's where they're headed next time.
Okay.
So I guess that means that we should talk about Helm's Deep. So overall, I mean, really, it's like fine.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people love Helm's Deep, and I think the best part about Helm's Deep is really the end. There's a whole conversation with Aragorn and Theoden in the movie that is flipped around, but I think it works really beautifully. Of, you know, like, you know, what would, you know, ride out and meet them for death and glory for Gondor, and they're like, yes, and then they go out on their horses and they go down the ramp, and that's when Gandalf shows up. I think that all feels really good and pretty comparable to the book, even more beautiful, I think, in the movie, with him showing up with Eomer. Fun fact that I know that is more than a fun fact. Like, if sometimes I just think, like, if New Beta were here, he would want to mention this.
Mm-hmm.
That Eomer was in the book, he's actually at Helm's Deep the whole time, and that's who Aragorn says, like, now is the hour where we will draw swords together, instead of Theoden saying it to Aragorn. It's a great line. I'm glad they kept it. But he says it to Eomer at one point, but because they're fighting together the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually Erkenbrand, who is the leader of the Westfold, who, you know, where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? That Theoden never questions Gondor on that. Everyone was busy when the Westfold fell. Okay. So Erkenbrand is who, his forces were scattered when they were attacked by Isengard, and when Gandalf learns that, he goes to get them, and that's who kind of helps seal the deal at the end there, along with the help of the trees. They do help. And the trees also help clean up after the fact, which is nice.
Aww.
So that feels good. The whole scene with, when, again, we kind of see Gimli being turned into a bit of comic relief, with, like, I cannot jump the distance, you'll have to toss me.
Yeah.
Don't tell the elf, like, that whole thing. I really do love how that plays out in the book, because Gimli does come in and have fun there, but it's a little different. So it's Eomer and Aragorn doing a similar thing. They, like, come out this side door. You know how they have all those orcs that are carrying these, like, battering rams, and they have shields, like, protecting them? So they can't come at the side door because it's a really narrow way, which is obviously on purpose, so that they can come out and kind of, like, fight them. And so here it is. So Eomer and Aragorn jump out there, they're fighting the orcs, and they feel like they've done a good job. I'm paraphrasing. And then they turn back to be like, okay, we gotta go fix the door now because it's all messed up. And they turn to leave, and then some of the orcs had been pretending to be dead. So the orcs trip Eomer, and then out of nowhere jumps Gimli. It says, but a small dark figure that none had observed sprang out of the shadows and gave a hoarse shout. Baruch Kazad, Kazad I Manu. An axe swung and swept back. 2 orcs fell headless. The rest fled. And so that was how Eomer and Aragorn were able to get out of that situation. And Eomer was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know you were there. And Gimli says, I followed you to shake off sleep, but I looked on the hillmen and they seemed overlarge for me, so I sat beside a stone to see your sword play. Just enjoying the show. And then he jumped in to help out at the end, which I thought was fun.
Goofy boy.
I know it. But I do like that those are, like, that's the reason that gets him worked up to speak Dwarvish, not to say something rude to Haldir.
Yeah.
Another thing that we kind of lose is, you know how in Fangorn, Gimli's feeling kind of anxious, he doesn't really like the vibe, and Legolas says, like, I could have been happy here, like, this is a cool place, and Gimli says, you comfort me. The same thing happens in Helm's Deep with Legolas and Gimli, where Legolas is feeling kind of weird about, being near the mountains and all this rock and wall and cave stuff, and Gimli is talking about how, like, if he had a bunch of his kin there, they could make it into a place that's, like, impenetrable. Like, he loves it. And Legolas repeats the line back to him, like, you comfort, like, dwarves are strange folk, but you comfort me. Like, I'm glad, where you go, I will go, kind of thing.
That's sweet.
I know. I think that those parallels are really cute, and we don't get them in the movie. Not to mention Gimli's description, which happens in the next chapter, The Road to Isengard, when they're leaving, but he describes the glittering caves to Legolas, and because there are caves behind Helm's Deep that are basically not really used. Like, they store stuff there. Some of the women and children that were in Helm's Deep were hiding there. At one point in the fight, Gimli gets separated from Legolas and Aragorn and with Eomer, and they have a fight back there, and that's when he's able to see it. And then later, we'll talk about it next time, but he describes the glittering caves. And I don't know if I can play a clip exactly, but I think I've sent it to you before, but there's a part where John Rhys-Davies, who plays Gimli on the Nerd of the Rings YouTube channel, he reads a part of Gimli's description of the glittering caves, and it's just, chef's kiss. Like, he could have played Book Gimli easily, And I'm still saying, while we have, R.I.P. Ian Holm and Christopher Lee, we don't have OG Bilbo or Saruman, but I'm just saying, I would pay money for a audiobook of the OG of the cast reading it, because that's what I want. That's my dream.
That's your dream? I'll put in a word.
Yeah. You know somebody on? know somebody we can contact. Because there are just so many really beautiful lines by Tolkien, and there are some great things. Like they change Theoden a little bit in the movies, and I think Bernard Hill delivers everything amazingly. He does such a good job. And like they make it out like it's Aragorn's idea to ride out and meet the orcs, but it's Theoden that asks Aragorn to ride out with him. And I'm like, I get it. Like, movie, Aragorn's the idea man. Like I don't begrudge them of changes like that, and everybody delivers them so beautifully. And we'll continue to see that in Return of the King. But there's so many lines like that, like these descriptive things that they say to each other. And obviously, I would always want Ian McKellen to give me more Gandalf. Like
always.
Oh, always. Clearly.
No question.
Yeah. So, but I think the biggest difference with Helm's Deep is like the treatment, as far as the focus on battle. Like for Peter, it's all about what happens during the battle, and so we get like more and bigger fighting scenes. Everything from Legolas using a shield like a surfboard to the explosion of the wall. It's a lot bigger. In the book, it's like, and I get it. Like in the book, it's like 2 explosions, one that's smaller, one that's bigger, and so they just do one big one in the movie, which I got it. But Tolkien, I think, tends to speak of combat more in general terms, and then tends to focus more on the aftermath. And I think that's just like his focus area is not so much on the sword play and all of that. Well, you can tell that he appreciates it in some ways. It's interesting because he says that finds himself most similar to Faramir, and Faramir is one that's famously quoted to say that I do not love the sword for its sharpness, nor bright steel. Let me find it. I want to say it exactly because it's a good one. I'm sure that there could be people listening. They're like, I know exactly what it is, and then good for you.
No one is saying that.
No one is saying that. Somebody knows exactly what it is. For myself, said Faramir, I would see the white tree in flower again, in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown return, and Minas Tirith in peace. Minas Arnor again, as of old, full of light, high and fair, beautiful as a queen among other queens, not a mistress of many slaves, nay, not even a kind mistress of willing slaves. War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer of who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend, and the city of the men of Numenor, and I would have her loved for her memory, her ancientry, her beauty, and her present wisdom, not feared, save as men may fear the dignity of a man old and wise. I feel like that is a quote that people really go to show like who Faramir is. And I think that speaks true to how Tolkien views the war stuff, because more often than not he will focus on the aftermath and kind of give you just like a general idea of how the battle went. Like when you're reading the Helm's Deep chapter, it focuses on these like little moments between like Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, like what they're up to, and then a few sentences here and there about like the orcs coming over the wall or sneaking into the culvert with the stream, but nothing like crazy. Whereas the battle scene is very large.
Sure.
I would say, and it's gonna get larger at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but in the movie anyway. So I think that so that's an interesting nuance to think about, right? As far as how Tolkien is dealing with it. One of the things that doesn't end up in the movie related to this is that it's not just supposed to be orcs. Obviously, that makes it easier in the movie for it just to be orcs that they're fighting. And do you remember the scene when Saruman gets the wild men of Dunland to swear to him, and they like cut the hand? Yeah. They are also supposed to be there.
Oh.
And it's not just orcs. And so at the end of the battle, all the orcs are dead. Several of the Dunland men have surrendered and they're afraid, you know. And they are basically told, like, help us clean up this mess that you made. Swear to never, like, take up arms against us again. They phrased it like, take arms across the fords of the Isen, basically into Rohan. And you can go back home. And they're like shook. They're shocked, right? Because Saruman told them that the men of Rohan were cruel and burned their captives alive.
Worse.
So I think that is important. You know, it reminds me a little bit of when Sam in the book and Faramir in the movie sees the dead warrior from Harad and says, like, would he not rather have stayed home in peace than to, be off fighting this war? And it's interesting because Faramir, even in the book, says, like, a lot of the men of Ithilien, like the Rangers of Gondor, refer to the Haradrim as cruel, and like cruel men of the South. And I'm sure, like, when you're in the middle of a war, you kind of have to other the people a little bit.
It's a tactic commonly used.
Yeah, well, and also to, like, live with yourself a little bit. If taking the life of other people, I would assume. I've never done that. Just, like, mentally, psychologically deal with that. But then you have these little moments of Tolkien pointing out, like, the humanity of these people that he isn't really, like, exploring, but saying, like, hey, it's not all easy. It's not all as black and white as, Sauron would probably even want you to think it is.
Absolutely.
So, a thing that gets lost in the movies, but I think it probably would have been nice to have that moment, I get why it isn't there, but sometimes it's interesting to think about, like, how I might have edited this together or added or taken away.
Yes.
Like, for example, the elves showing up at Helm's Deep, like, that doesn't happen. But honestly, when you think about it, how would they have even, like, known to be there? So like, in the movie, they have Galadriel telepathically talking to Elrond about, like, would you have them stand alone? And I guess they just know everything that's happening, apparently, but not truly the case. Like, Lorien was dealing with their own problems, and Rivendell's very far away at that point. I mean, you can tell it's Haldir, like, they met him in Lothlorien, but I feel like it's kind of implied that it's a mix of elves from both places. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but
I didn't think
about it.
Yeah,
but elves show up. They do not, but in the books, you can see why, because they take Gandalf's advice to ride off to meet Saruman head on and say, hey, screw you, buddy, you can't take over our land. And then it's like they meet one of their own men that was recently fighting at the fords of Isen, and they're like, all of Saruman's army is emptied, they're hot on our tail, and then they're like, okay, we're off to Helm's Deep. And as they're riding to Helm's Deep, like, the Uruk-hai, they are not that far behind. They can turn around and, like, see them marching, and it's like, oh, shit. Like, so then you gotta pick up the pace and get there before the Uruk-hai do. So there's, like, no time in between, But in the movies, they have Aragorn, like, obviously, because he'd fallen off that cliff during, like, the fake wargs fight. And he's the one that's like, oh my gosh, there's like 10,000 Uruk-hai headed your way. what are you gonna do? And they also make it out like there's only like 300 men in Helm's Deep. It's definitely more than that. I think a number like 1,000 is mentioned at some point, but don't quote me. So yeah, so that's Helm's Deep. And one thing that's funny that I have never noticed before is that you have, because when normally you read straight through, you don't flip back and forth like this, but we're doing that. So we have the men of Dunland. They call them the wild men of Dunland in the books. But then in the chapter with Frodo and Faramir and Sam, Faramir, when he's giving this account of the men of Middle Earth, he talks about how there are different types of men, similar to how, like, you talk about the Eldar elves or the Sindar elves, or I don't know. There's a bunch of them that I'm not very concerned about. Noldor, Sylvan, I don't know. There's a bunch. There's high elves. There's elves of the Twilight. They got names upon names to categorize all these elves depending on where they live or how far if they traveled to Valinor or not, all kinds of stuff. Faramir does a similar categorization where he says high men, or aka men of the West, or Númenóreans. So like some of Faramir's ancestry, definitely Aragorn's ancestry. And then there's the middle peoples, so men of the Twilight, who basically just kind of like have always been Middle Earth people, and he says the Rohirrim are an example of men of the Twilight. And then you have the wild men, aka men of darkness, or the Dunlandings. And so that makes me just think like all of this naming convention is in relation to elves / Númenor. So like basically how much you learned from elves or the gods. So like the Númenóreans used to be the closest to the elves and learned a lot, and had they were even gifted a land of their own from the Valar, from the gods. And then you have the men of the Twilight, who I'm guessing were more receptive to the teachings of the Númenóreans, people that they were able to ally themselves with. And then you have men of darkness, who probably were just like, no, I don't want anything to do with you. I'm doing my own thing. I wouldn't necessarily consider it like evil, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In that sense. Just less enlightened, maybe. But I had never noticed that before. Like specifically calling them wild men. I just thought it was rude. But I'm like, oh, you're thinking of it in terms of like their knowledge base, I guess, in comparison to your own. I mean, obviously it's maybe a little ethnocentric, but maybe. But yeah, never really noticed that before.
Fascinating.
So thought I would throw it out there. And that's really where we leave off. Like in the movies, we see, basically just the battle is over, and Gandalf is saying like the battle for Helm's Deep is over. The battle for Middle Earth is about to begin. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are back on track as far as they're headed. They're going to head back towards Mordor now. Headed towards Minas Morgul is their next step up the stairs. And Merry and Pippin are, enjoying the spoils of victory.
Yeah, they are.
Stormworm. And I don't think we know about the Stormworm thing in the book yet, but I think that's fine to give Merry and Pippin a little chill moment. And actually, in the book, we haven't seen Merry and Pippin go that far yet. In the book, the Treebeard chapter ends with the Ents marching to war, and then we don't really know more until we see them again, like in person. Like there's the whole release the river part, which I love. I love the Ents taking over Isengard.
Nice scene.
It's so good. Like I just love like Saruman panicking, like he's like, what is happening? And even the orcs like trying to chop up the trees or set them on fire, and they're able to like get around all of those shenanigans, releasing the river. So in the release the river moment happens in the book when they're on the way to Isengard. They notice that the riverbed is empty, and they're like, well, what kind of
The fuck?
yeah, exactly. Like, what is Saruman up to? And then at one point, when they're like at night, I think it happens. You know, the waters rush back in, and they're like, okay, what the heck is going on? And they notice steam rising from Isengard. So a lot of that happens in the background, and then we'll probably hear about it like secondhand, you know, from Merry and Pippin. But I do love seeing it in the movie. I think it's beautifully done.
Nice. It is. It's a very interesting part.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's nice. It's nice for Merry and Pippin. One thing that I will say about like the whole Entmoot part, like them in the movie acting like they're not gonna go to war until Pippin tricks Treebeard into seeing Isengard and the damage they've done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, give the Ents a little credit. They've been around for a long time, and they have seen this stuff going down, and they come to this conclusion on their own. They do come to this conclusion. It just takes them like 3 days to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the way that Treebeard puts it is they go over like all the facts, and then their decision making is fast. It's just that it's literally, I feel like they must think of everything like a court. Like they go through all the facts and events, and then they decide. And
I also have lots of rules.
yeah. So, but then they decide, and it's funny because like Merry and Pippin aren't actually with them when they decide. Treebeard comes and like picks them up basically from, because they were bored because they don't speak English.
Uh-huh.
And so he's like, the Ents are going to war. They're like, that is great. And so that's where they're left at the end of the Treebeard chapter. So it'll be interesting to see how it's described, you know, after the fact in the book.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that means that the next chapters we're gonna finish. So we started the road to Isengard in this and Journey to the Crossroads a bit. We're gonna see the rest of that next time, and then we're also gonna, I think, just fully flesh out the scene in Isengard with the chapters Flotsam and Jetsam and the voice of Saruman.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great. So I'll see you there. The rest of you will hear us there next time for 4 whole chapters that we're going to cover.
Damn.
So, I know. I think this is one of our chunkier chapter episodes, probably since the Tom Bombadil stuff. So, we'll see you there, and thanks for tuning in.